There are losses that a team absorbs and moves past quickly. The kind that sting for an evening, get discussed briefly in the post-game, and are forgotten by the time the next day's batting practice begins. Professional baseball teams play 162 games in a regular season. They have to develop a collective ability to compartmentalize. To process a defeat, extract whatever lessons it contains, and redirect their energy forward. And then there are losses that don't stay in their compartment. The kind that crack something open. That surface uncomfortable questions about roster construction, bullpen management, and the particular pressure that comes with building an entire organizational identity around a single player's shoulders. The kind that make managers say things in post-game press conferences that travel far beyond the walls of the media room and become, almost immediately, something that the entire baseball world is discussing. What happened after the Dodgers' bullpen collapsed was that kind of loss. By the time Dave Roberts sat down in front of the microphones, the game was over in the technical sense. The final out had been recorded. The scoreboard had delivered its verdict. The come-from-behind loss was official, documented, and irreversible. But something else was just beginning. Because what Roberts said about Shohei Ohtani in the minutes that followed, measured words, carefully chosen, spoken by a man who understands that every syllable he delivers in that room will be examined, replayed, and interpreted, ignited a conversation that nobody in the Dodgers organization was fully prepared for. And then Sheehan spoke. And others followed. And what had begun as a post-game press conference became something much larger and more significant than a single bullpen collapse in a single regular season game. So what exactly did Roberts say? What did Sheehan reveal that added fuel to an already burning conversation? And what does all of it mean for Ohtani, for the Dodgers, and for the extraordinary weight that comes with being the most important player in baseball? To understand the post-game explosion, you first have to understand what the game itself revealed. The Dodgers entered the late innings with a lead that felt, if not entirely comfortable, then at least manageable. Their starting pitching had done its job. The offensive contributions had been sufficient. The game was positioned exactly where a team with the Dodgers' resources and talent expects to position games when they are executing properly. Ahead. In control. Moving toward a result that confirms the organizational confidence that surrounds this roster every single day of the season. Then the bullpen entered. What followed was the kind of inning that defies simple statistical description. Not because the numbers aren't damning, they are, but because numbers capture what happened without capturing how it happened. The sequence. The momentum shift. The specific, accelerating feeling inside a stadium when a crowd senses that the team they came to watch is losing its grip on a game they were supposed to win. Pitches that should have been strike three became walks. Walks became base runners. Base runners became runs. And runs became a deficit that the Dodgers, despite every resource available to them, could not recover from in the innings that remained. The dugout during that sequence told its own story. Ohtani watched from the bench with the expression he always carries in difficult moments. Not detached. Not performing calm for the cameras. But genuinely measured in the way that comes from a person who has developed, over years of competing at the highest level, a real rather than performative relationship with pressure. He had done his part. His contributions to the game had been exactly what the Dodgers needed them to be. The collapse had nothing to do with him. And yet, in the post-game conversation that followed, his name became the center of everything. Post-game press conferences after difficult losses have a particular texture. Managers arrive already processing. Already reviewing the decisions they made, the calls that might have gone differently, the moments where a different choice might have produced a different result. They sit down knowing that the questions they are about to receive are designed to surface exactly those moments, to identify the decision points where, in hindsight, the game could have been saved. Roberts sat down with the composure of a man who has done this many times. Who has learned that the press conference is its own form of performance, requiring its own discipline and its own carefully maintained balance between honesty and strategic communication. The early questions were expected. Bullpen management. Pitch selection. The specific sequence of decisions that produced the collapse. Roberts answered them with the practiced clarity of a veteran manager who understands his accountability and accepts it without deflection. Then the questions shifted to Ohtani. And what Roberts said in response, not defensively, not with any visible agenda, but with the quiet weight of a man speaking something he genuinely believes, is what has been replayed and discussed and debated across the baseball world since the moment it left his mouth. He said that in games like this one, in losses that come from the bullpen rather than from any failure of the player who defines this roster, he thinks about Ohtani differently than he thinks about the rest of the team. He said he thinks about the weight Ohtani carries that nobody else on the roster carries in the same way. The expectation weight. The symbolic weight. The understanding that when the Dodgers lose in this fashion, the conversation inevitably returns to whether the team built around him is sufficient to support what he brings to it every single night. He said, quietly and with clear sincerity, that Ohtani deserves better than what the bullpen gave him tonight. 5 words. Delivered without drama. Without performance. The room went very still. If Roberts' comments opened the conversation, what Sheehan said afterward pushed it into territory that nobody had anticipated. Pitcher Caleb Sheehan, one of the bullpen members whose performance had contributed to the collapse, did not take the path of minimum resistance in his post-game availability. He did not offer the standard language of accountability that experienced players use to acknowledge failure without saying anything that will linger. He said something real. He talked about the specific experience of being a Dodgers pitcher in the context of a roster built around Ohtani. About the awareness, present in every high-leverage appearance, that the margin for error is different when you are protecting a lead that Ohtani's performance helped create. That the meaning attached to each pitch is different when you understand what a collapse costs, not just in the standings, but in the larger narrative surrounding a team and a player that the entire baseball world is watching with unusual intensity. He said that tonight, he felt that weight and was unable to perform at the level it required. The honesty of that statement landed differently than the typical post-game accountability language. Because it wasn't just about the pitches. It was about the psychological reality of pitching in a specific role, on a specific roster, within a specific set of expectations that the presence of a player like Ohtani creates whether anyone intends it or not. Other bullpen members, prompted by Sheehan's candor, added their own voices to the conversation. The picture that emerged was of a group of pitchers who care deeply about the responsibility they carry. Who understand, perhaps more clearly than any external analysis can capture, what it means to be the part of the machine that failed on a night when the most important part of the machine had performed exactly as required. Here is the part of this story that the box score and the bullpen analysis and the post-game quotes cannot fully address. Ohtani carries a weight that is unique in professional baseball. Not just the physical weight of being a two-way player, managing the demands of pitching and hitting across a full major league season. But an organizational weight. A symbolic weight. The weight of being the player around whom an entire franchise's ambitions and identity have been constructed. When the Dodgers win, his contributions are central to the narrative. When the Dodgers lose, even in games where his performance was excellent, even in collapses entirely disconnected from anything he did or failed to do, the conversation returns to him. Because he is the constant. The fixed point around which everything else is evaluated. This is an unusual and demanding form of attention to live inside. Most players, even great ones, exist within a team context that distributes responsibility broadly. A loss is shared. An underperformance by one unit is absorbed by the collective. The narrative doesn't collapse back to a single player with the same gravitational force that it collapses back to Ohtani. He navigates this reality with a composure that people close to him describe as genuine rather than performed. He has developed, over years of living under extraordinary scrutiny, a relationship with external attention that keeps it outside the space where his preparation and performance actually happen. But the weight is real. It exists whether he acknowledges it or not. And on nights like this one, when the bullpen collapses and the loss lands in the record books and Dave Roberts sits down at the microphone and says that Ohtani deserves better, the weight becomes briefly and publicly visible in a way that it usually isn't. Beyond the individual storylines, the bullpen collapse and the conversation that followed it raised questions about the Dodgers as a constructed team that will not fade quickly. The organizational philosophy surrounding Ohtani has been one of concentration. Building the most exceptional possible player at the center of the roster and surrounding him with sufficient support to translate individual greatness into collective success. But support is not uniform. Offense can carry games that pitching fails to hold. Pitching can compensate for offensive shortfalls. The specific vulnerability exposed by a bullpen collapse is one that no amount of offensive firepower can retroactively address. When the lead disappears in the late innings, the performance that created it becomes, in the most practical sense, irrelevant to the final result. This is the tension at the heart of the post-game conversation. Not that the Dodgers lack quality. They demonstrably do not. But that the specific pattern of this loss, a lead built by excellent performance surrendered by bullpen failure, points to a vulnerability that the organization will need to address if the expectations surrounding this roster are to be met at the level that everyone involved understands they must be. Roberts knows this. His comments about Ohtani deserving better were not simply generous words toward a great player. They were the honest acknowledgement of a manager who understands exactly what the gap between Ohtani's performance and the bullpen's performance cost his team on that particular evening. By the time Roberts and Sheehan had spoken, by the time the conversation had traveled across every baseball platform and landed in discussions that extended far beyond the sport itself, Ohtani was asked directly about the post-game reaction his name had generated. He answered the way he always answers difficult questions. Simply. Without deflection. Without the performance of humility that sophisticated public figures sometimes produce when they want to appear humble without actually exposing anything real. He said the bullpen didn't lose the game. The other team won it. He said that in a 162-game season, the conversations that happen after individual losses matter less than the preparation that happens before the next one. He said he has enormous respect for the pitchers who work in high-leverage situations night after night and that a single difficult outing says nothing meaningful about their character or their capability. He said he was already thinking about tomorrow. Not as a deflection. As a genuine statement of where his attention actually lives. The room received it the way Ohtani's answers are usually received. With the quiet recognition that the person speaking is not managing the conversation. He is simply telling the truth about how he processes things. And the truth, in this case, was that while the rest of the baseball world was still inside the loss, he had already moved past it. Dave Roberts will make different bullpen decisions in future games. Sheehan and the others will take the mound again in high-leverage situations and will have the opportunity to respond to a difficult night with the kind of performance that rewrites the narrative. That is the nature of a long season. Every game is both consequential and temporary. Every loss contains within it the seed of the response that follows. But what this particular loss produced, beyond the entry in the standings and the statistical record of a bullpen collapse, is a moment of unusual clarity about the ecosystem surrounding Shohei Ohtani. About the weight that Dave Roberts carries as the manager of a roster built around singular greatness. About the psychological reality that Sheehan named honestly when most players would have chosen safer language. About the gap between what Ohtani delivers on any given night and what the structure around him sometimes fails to match. And about Ohtani himself. Who sat in front of microphones after a loss that generated more conversation about him than any of his individual performances that week. Who heard his manager say he deserves better. Who heard his teammates speak honestly about the weight of pitching in his context. And who responded by talking about tomorrow. Not because the loss didn't matter. It did. Not because the conversation didn't reach him. It did. But because the characteristic that separates him from almost every other player in the sport is not the velocity of his fastball or the distance of his home runs. It is the direction his attention moves when most people are still looking backward. The bullpen collapsed. The Dodgers lost. Dave Roberts said something that became a hot topic. Sheehan spoke with honesty that the baseball world respected. And Shohei Ohtani was already preparing for the next game. That is who he is. That is why the conversation always comes back to him. And that is why it always will.